stop the spiral before it begins. We show you that anxiety is actually just like a habit, and it's a habit that's reinforced so often because anxiety can be an umbrella for many, many different uncomfortable emotions. Now, the 7 step reset was not designed for anxiety. I designed the 7 step reset for transformation. And the reason is because in my 7 performance areas, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and then relationship, professional, financial, the idea is to work laps, run laps around the mental, physical, spiritual to build that up and create the identity that we need. And then we go into the relationship, professional, financial. That's important because when you go after the thing first and the identity is not there, we need shortcuts, we have frustration, we get stuck, and we end up using suboptimal practices or tactics. And then, in the worst case, corruption enters because the person wants to get there fast and they don't know what to do. So, the reason why we run the laps is to form the identity. But to run the laps, we first have to create the right habits. And the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. So this is why I use the 7 step reset. So if you think about mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, we can change habits in each one of those areas and run that program first. And then when we get into the relationship, professional, financial, the habits are already there. And today we're talking about the action steps. So earlier I was running. If you tuned in earlier, you would have seen this. Get back there. So if you came in earlier, you would have seen this video running, infographics, and I run it because it's a reminder that we don't use what we know. So too often people focus on doing something, learning something more knowledge, a better understanding. But we know so much. If you just look at the titles on these infographics, you know much of this. If you've been leading any number of years, you know most of this, so you've heard it before. But to know and not do is like not knowing, and that's why I was running this as the entry. And I also have this on my website now at the 7stepreset.com, and I'll put that in the chat. The 7stepreset.com/live is where I provide information about these live events. You're welcome to go there, and you'll see the yesterday's video. Hold on a second, type first. So there you'll see the video from yesterday, and you'll also see the upcoming one for today. And then today's will get replaced. That'll get moved over to yesterday's, and then there'll be a new one, or at least the setup where you can find the link to join online. So the link to join online is I'll put that in the chat as well. And you can, so that'll change every day because each day it's a new event, so to speak. But you'll be able to join me on stage, and then we can have a conversation. So at the end of these, I do allow time for some coaching, self-coaching, discussion, whatever you want to do, and you can get there by using that link. All right, let's turn this off. So today what we're going to be talking about is the fifth step. So yesterday I covered the fifth step, which is emotional modulation. And emotional modulation is that one that could add 90 seconds to that 1 second reset, or the 1 second stimulus response cycle. So you may recall, or you've probably heard me talk about, we make 33,000 decisions a day. And through all those decisions, they're priming us for the next decision. So if you go and look at the prior steps, we have pre-stimulus, we have first pre-stimulus, and this is ongoing. This is who we are, and it's whatever stimulus is coming. But because we are going through 33,000 decisions a day, and it's actually more like 100,000 stimulus response cycles a day, this is ongoing. So we want to, one, start the day off right. This is why a lot of your gurus will talk about rituals. But we also want to maintain it and then get back to it quickly, because if one of these stimulus response cycles cause us to be quote unquote triggered, we have to be able to get back to that next one. If we're awake 65,000 or so seconds a day, we're getting a new one of these every other second, and we don't know what's coming. And there's two ways you can approach this. You can control your environment so tightly, put all these rules around yourself so you never get triggered. And I tried that. And the danger is that when one does get through, you don't have the skills to get over it. I've learned the hard way that you're much better off having the skills to get back to homeostasis very quickly. And that's why we have this mindfulness piece here, because you can't control your environment, especially if you're moving into something new, right? So the idea of designing or creating in the field of infinite possibilities means you're going to be faced with the unfamiliar most of the time. And we have to be able to fix that. So that's all pre-stimulus. It's how we're showing up, but also can we get back there? And this is state. So the first one is beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, physiology. And you could go back and look at the videos. Some of them are on the website as well, but they're also on this platform wherever you're watching this one. I'll leave them up for at least 7 days, so you can always go back and watch one of the earlier ones. And then we have the state of being, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. What state are you in? And that state has a lot to do with what shows up here in the conditioned reaction. This is a quarter of a second. This stimulus, or this stimulus to conditioned reaction is a it comes online in a quarter of a second, and it will last about a quarter of a second, about 250 milliseconds, and then it's ready to hand off that information to the conscious. But too often we make the response step 4 equal to the reaction, especially if you're already stressed out, if you're already in fight or flight. The likelihood of response being exactly the same as the reaction is very high. This is how you get people just destroy relationships, or they destroy opportunities, because they get triggered, they freak out, and they react out of this fear. And that fear is the worst thing. People have just get up and quit in the middle of a meeting. They just get up and quit. I mean, all sorts of things have happened because they don't have the regulation skills to manage it. And then in step 4, we talked about, yes, you can make the response within a quarter of a half a second. So it's stimulus happens, you have a quarter of a second reaction time for the network of neurons, aka subconscious. Then you have another quarter of a second for the conscious mind to come online. But I say wait another quarter of a second. So now we have 3/4 of a second from the stimulus before you respond. And the reason for that is the network of neurons processes at 11 million bits per second, whereas the conscious mind only processes at 50 bits per second. And if we start right off the bat, we don't have a way to assess what's actually coming in from the subconscious. So through this process, you will actually be discounting what you get from the subconscious. Why? Subconscious, also known as network of neurons, It's from the past. These are associations from the past. What worked in the past is not necessarily what's right for the present and the future, especially if you're innovating or you're in a new project, you're doing something new, designing in the field of infinite possibilities. We need at least a quarter of a second. That only gives you 12 bits, 12 and a half bits, right? 50 bits per second processing. And meanwhile, the subconscious is processed anywhere from 2 to 3 million bits. And that handoff is going to happen here. And in the step 4, we talk about what to do with that quarter of a second that it's a pause. You're not just pausing and waiting, it's actively having the subconscious organize the information that is processed, because 2 to 3 million bits is a lot of information, and it can hand it off to you in a way that now it's actionable and you can do something about it. Step 5 was what we talked about yesterday. That's the emotional modulation. If you are, and one of the things you're going to do here in step 4 is check in to see how you're doing. If you're being triggered, then we want to make sure that we modulate those emotions before we act. And today we're talking about action. Now, I'll put this slide up because I think it's important to see how this all fits together. And I'm going to talk about it from the I'll talk about it holistically using the 7 steps, and then how that leads up to the action. Now, when I think about people dealing with anxiety, and again, this is not mental health. I like to state that this is not mental health. When a person is is in that moment of anxiety, what they don't realize is this is not happening in the mind. It's happening in the network of neurons. It's not mental health. It's happening in the network of neurons. And neurons that fire together wire together. And the more that we generalize into anxiety, the more we're reinforcing and building those neural pathways. If you look up myelin, that's the wrapping of the neurons that make them fire faster, more powerfully, and 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 more accurately as well. That process of myelination is making the habit stronger and stronger and stronger. So when you think about muscle memory, what you're doing is building up myelin around the neurons, and you're also engaging synaptogenesis, which is strengthening the neurotransmitter between the neurons, and this strengthens that neural pathway, which is why after spending time with muscle memory, it happens automatically. It's just there. It's such a strong habit. But what people miss is that it's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. And the same nervous system that governs our muscles is the same nervous system that governs our thoughts, our actions, our speaking. So by working through from a habit standpoint, you're able to, using myelin, using synaptogenesis, to have the habitual thought patterns that serve your design, your life design, as opposed to interfere with it. Now, let's pull up a bit of the screen. So the 7 steps again, the beliefs, neuroplasticity, and let me do it this way. We're going to talk about the action step here, and I've been doing 1 step per day. So you can go back to last Thursday and catch one. And I spent a couple of days on 1 and 2, and then I did 3, and then yesterday was emotion. Monday was the response. So Friday would have been the conditioned reaction. So now in step 6, I want you to have this picture, especially if this is the first time you're seeing this, because most people feel like I, I've tried everything, nothing works. I don't know I don't know how to do anything different. Those things don't work for me. First of all, hacks don't work. So if you've tried hacks and they don't work, they're not supposed to work. Why? Well, you don't expect them to work. Why? Because the central nervous system is always working towards homeostasis, meaning stability. It wants stability back to the way things have always been. So if you accept the fact that 95% of everything we do is done by habit, So if you accept that everything we do is done, 95% of everything we do is done by habit, that habit is what the central nervous system is working towards. It makes sense if you think about it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint. 10,000 years, our system has been serving hunter-gatherers. That's the evolution of it. And now, this last few hundred years, we're living in this kind of, uh, you know, with automation and automobiles and things of that nature. But for 9,000 and several hundred of those years, it was a hunter-gatherer environment. So it makes a lot of sense that we're going to get back to the habits. Why? Because most of habit formation is formed from 0 to 7, and that's because you probably heard this part that babies and small young children are in the alpha state, so theta state for 2 years, and then alpha state for about 5, and everything goes in. They don't have to work for it. It's just that they're a sponge. It's like being in a hypnotic state. Everything goes in automatically. That's how the habits are formed. But what you don't see written about much, because it wasn't until the last several decades when we've had the brain scanning tools to see what was actually going on. In fact, myelin was thought to be inert matter up until like 1960. So we didn't even understand that part. But from 0 to 7, the threshold for myelination is very, very low. So that stuff that just comes in, it's automatically myelinating those neurons, because in hunter-gatherer environment, from 0 to 7, that kid is learning how to hunt and gather and get along in the tribe. So they're learning from their environment, and you can see that with how kids pick up language, how kids pick up reading. And then the other thing that's unique to that 0 to 7 is there's an abundance of neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are created by the brain and nervous system, central nervous system, but it takes a lot of energy. And so by the time we're 30, the brain is so stingy on that neurotransmitter, it makes it easy to just fall into living by habit. Again, it makes sense if the hunter-gatherer is alive through 35 and they learn to hunt and gather at 0 to 7, the chances of the hunting processes, protocols changing by the time they're 35 is almost nil, right? The way they hunt at 35 would have been the same way they learned to hunt at 7. That's not the way it is for us today. The computers, the speed, the technology curve, exponential curve. I mean, we've been doubling the technology capability every 18 months since about 1970. So if you think about an exponential curve, you've seen doubling a penny for 10 years and 20 years, what that curve looks like, or doubling a penny every day for 20 days or 30 days. You've seen what that exponential curve looks like. And we're on that vertical part, which is even with AI, which was just a few years ago, was this big new thing. Now all of a sudden there's like new AI providers and new platforms, and we're on Chat GPT-5, and it's constantly changing. That's not going back. We're not going backwards. And this is why people, in my opinion, live with so much anxiety, which is why I use the transformation, because you can learn to react to every single stimulus that's coming in. Or what you can do is focus on becoming stable and steady, so that no matter what happens, you know what to do, because one, you act out of principle, and by acting out of principle, you know the world is going to conform around you. So I have this slide up because we're going to talk about step 6, but I want you to imagine that all of those thoughts that you can't do it, all those thoughts that it doesn't work for you, all of those thoughts that you've tried everything, I want to debunk these before we talk about step 6. So beliefs, we have levers. Each one of these has dozens of levers. There's levers to identify and then neutralize your limiting beliefs. You have command of the neuroplasticity, so you're able to replace unwanted habits with the habits that are designed for your life design, and that's what I call automaticity. So we put the automaticity to work for us. Priming. You've moved from an environment where you're being primed haphazardly by all these other forces that would like you to do what they want you to do instead of your life vision. You're priming yourself, and then mindset. Not only do you have a growth mindset, but you're able to get back to a growth mindset very quickly and effectively. And the frequency that you return to a growth mindset, you're building a habit of having a growth mindset. It's very difficult to get knocked off. Without this process, it's very easy for people to go from a growth mindset to a fixed mindset. And you can have a fixed mindset within a topic that you have a growth mindset. You may have a growth mindset around physical fitness, but then there's elements within fitness that you have a fixed mindset and don't even realize it because your view is you have a growth mindset. And then physiology, courageous physiology versus defeated physiology. That's all I need to say, right? You can look at Amy Cutter on YouTube, and she talks about these different physiologies and how they've actually increased things like testosterone. People come back and debate that, but if you look at it from a neurotransmitter standpoint, what's going on with neurotransmitters? The more neurotransmitter production you have, the more testosterone is developed, or estrogen in women after menopause, plus HGH, human growth hormone, mitochondria, etc. All of that is coming when you improve neurotransmitters. So physiology is a huge topic in this. Step two is really a check-in to see how we're doing. So you have your mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional state. How am I doing? And then we have levers to get back there quickly because you may start your day off well. You may get thrown off course. You need a way to get back there. And that's what we do in step two. And then you have self-image. So it's not just what is the self-image, it's auditing it. It's being able to audit where's my self-image. We have to do this thousands of times a day. We're making 33,000 decisions a day, a decision every other second. You can see that if we slip here, we can ruin you can ruin your day. Now you have a conditioned reaction, a stimulus. And there are people who, like I said, they so control their environment. I've read some things about actors and actresses who control everything on the set so they don't get knocked off course. I understand that because before doing a big presentation, I always put myself in a bubble. I had specific rituals before going on stage. I had specific rituals. I isolated myself. I left the hotel. I went to a place where I wouldn't interact with anybody that I knew. I controlled this whole thing, which was effective until something slips through. When something slips through, then you don't have the tools to deal with it. So this approach to me is much more effective. So now we have a conditioned reaction. This happens in a quarter of a second. I'm not going to go too much in depth now, but just understand that there's so many levers because this step the, is happening in the subconscious or the network of neurons, and we process at 11 million bits per second in the network of neurons. So in a quarter of a second, a ton of information has already been processed. Fortunately, there's a filtering system in place that we can guide. We, with our conscious mind, can guide and influence that, not only influence but direct that filtering system so we get through the information that we need. That's what I was talking about in step four, that we're not just pausing, we're using the reticular activating system to deliver to us the kind of information we need from that stimulus. And then the rest of step four is responding and a check-in as well. We don't want the response to equal the reaction. That's a given. However, you, the the action is do it, delay it, delegate it, and discard it, or discard it. You can do what the reaction is suggesting, but it's a conditioned step. So it comes in, and by having principles and aligned with purpose, etc., like that, it's a very easy process to do. None of this is rocket science. There's very little new terminology. Reticular activating system might be the one neuroscience term that I tend to use. I don't really explain myelin and synaptogenesis, but I'm talking about the 7 steps. I don't need to because we're not wanting to understand how the car is built. We want to understand how to drive the car. And when it comes to driving the central nervous system, you don't need to understand the amygdala and the hippocampus and all that. You just, if you do the steps, it'll work. Now, if you want to go into a deeper dive, and I invite people to come online, just look in the chat. There's a link. You can use that link. Come online. We'll have a discussion about it during the live event. It's 8 a.m. to about 8:45 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then we get to step five. And step five is the emotional modulation. Now, I say often that this whole process, each stimulus response cycle, is only like 3/4 of a second. Quarter of a second if you're letting the reaction equals if you're letting the response equals the reaction, that's not where we're going. So now, back to my positioning, we now have manage the stimulus reaction so the automaticity is working for us. We have a check-in step, so we're able to make sure that any action we take is going to be aligned with our life design. The automaticity is working for us. And if we are being triggered or there's some emotional thing happening, some anxiety that we're feeling, we have an emotional modulation step that adds up to about 90 seconds, which means this whole process could take 2 minutes or a minute and a half. Now, if you track with me through this, you'll see by the time you get to the action step, the majority, in fact, by the time you get to the emotional modulation step, the majority of triggers and things to set you off and impulses to go into fight or flight, they've all been neutralized. They are not there. So we're hitting step 5 with very few compared to what we had. In fact, one of the steps we do here in conditioned reaction is to retrain the subconscious so that it's passing through 80% of the stimuli it gets as non-threats. Left to its own, the subconscious is going to see the majority, well over 80%, as a threat. And because neurons that fire together wire together, once that threat is perceived, it just builds up. And this is what that feeling comes, that people feel like it's an anxiety spiral that people like to avoid. So by having these tools, it doesn't even come into play. And if it does, you have the tools to reverse it or to stop it. Now we get to step 6. And step 6 is where we take action. Now that action, as I said, is do it, delay, hold on. Do it, delay it, delegate it, or discard it. And that do it is 95% of the time. If 95% of our lives is by habit, for me, I would say that 80 to 90% of the time, I'm just going to do what the subconscious reaction, what's aligned with the subconscious reaction. But I've gone through the training. I've come to myself. I've taken command of the neuroplasticity. I'm probably not getting 33,000 stimulus response cycles a day because I ignore a lot of them. I don't even acknowledge them. I don't even allow the stimulus to come in. I guess there could be another step, ignoring, right? That would happen in the step 3 to 4 where you just ignore it, which is what I'm doing most of the time. So I don't think that I ever want to have the majority of my day be driven by the conscious mind. I don't have that kind of bandwidth. I like the fact that my subconscious is running on habit. But what's important is that the subconscious is serving my conscious mind. It's not in charge of my conscious mind. I've seen people say that the subconscious is like the higher self. I've seen people talk about how the subconscious governs us, which is a very popular thought, by the way. Uh, I used to say the subconscious has the tactical advantage over the conscious mind. But now that I understand this process, after going through training with neuroscientists, being able to ask some of the questions that were perplexing, and looking at it and comparing it with other things that are principles, you see that the subconscious, as a network of neurons, it is subservient. That's why it's below the conscious mind. So we have the higher self, and I say that's how we interact with the spiritual realm, whatever that means for you. And that's like the vision. And then we have the conscious mind is the programmer, and then the subconscious is the program. And the conscious mind tells the program how to be programmed. You don't let the programmer program itself. The conscious mind has to program the program. Now, when we get into step 6, what I want to talk about here is beyond the do it, delay it, delegate it. And by the way, a lot of times my delegation is to chat GPT. That's part of the delegation. Or delaying it could be I just put it off into. But I do a lot of short-term fixes. When I'm in innovation mode, I do a lot of short-term fixes. And that short-term fix is sometimes to stop the bleeding. If there's a big problem that comes up, rather than design a quick fix solution, I'll do a short-term fix to stop the bleeding so that I can properly respond. And that could be a form of delaying or do it. So here's what I want to talk about in this action step. The first thing I like to do is have frameworks. So if you have a framework, and a common one for me is to use the hold on a second. All right. Anyway, a common one for me is to use. There we go. Hold on. This little screen here was. I knew what was going on. But there we go. Now, I like a two-axis framework. I like a two-axis framework, and because most of what we're dealing with, we have some tension. I was just reading. I saw something the other day where this journal made a decision that had been lingering for years, and the decision was made very quickly. And he, when asked how he was able to make it so quickly, he said, "These guys have been fighting this thing for years. If there was a clear winner, it would have been the decision would have been made. It's obvious that both of these are pretty good, or are good. So why spend more time? We want to get into trial and error. We want to put one out there. If it works, we'll know right away. We'll double down. If it doesn't work, we'll know right away and we'll replace it." The I like what Mike Tyson says. He says no plan. He says everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face. I say no. Very seldom does a plan survive contact with reality, and especially now in the VUCA world, with the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, we want to be able to do more trial and error. And again, this gets back to the 7-step reset, because we don't want to be feeling like we lost because something doesn't work. You have to have that growth mindset as you're doing the trial and error. And the tension that arises when it's time to take action, so you can have growth and profit. That's one I like to use. And which one is more important? And you can say, well, they're both important. We could debate that all day long. But one thing you could do is to say, all right, let's take a look. Let's say we had growth and no profit. How's that work? And you'll have the salespeople saying, yes, that's what we want. But wait a minute. If you have no profit, then what happens if there's a pandemic? With no profit, you don't have the staying power to stay in the game. What happens if you don't have growth? You just have profit. You have profit. What happens if there's a pandemic? You get to stay in the game, and you have options, because if you have profit, you can do other things. So now you know which one is more important, and you can still work to get as far out here as possible. But as you get this arc, you're not going to go too far on the growth where it puts tension, where it takes away from the profit. This is a hard thing for people to get, because almost every B2B salesperson is selling you on revenue, and it's a compelling conversation. We need to make sure that we are not buying in that moment, that we're going back and we're looking at the profit, and we're looking at not just profit, because when you're primed by the salesperson, you're thinking good day of a good week. We need to be profitable on a bad day of a bad week. And by stepping away from that conversation, coming back later, you can say, on a bad day of a bad week, what does the profit look like with this solution? And now you're in more of a productive conversation. Another one that I like to use is efficiency and effectiveness. Again, suppose you had total efficiency with no effectiveness. How would that be? You know, you're do it now and move on to the next one, guys. You're going to love the efficiency, but if it's not effective, what's the point? You get there first, but you don't have anything in your suitcase. So we want to make sure we have effectiveness. And again, you can push this out, but I say effective first, then efficiency. Go after effectiveness first, and then you look at efficiency. When you're hiring somebody, you have attitude and skills. The idea is you're looking at the resume and you're doing behavioral descriptive interviewing, you're focusing on skills. But if they have the skills and the wrong attitude, what's the likelihood of the skills being applied in the way that serves your vision? So again, you can push it out. And if they have the right attitude, I can teach them the skills. So we want profit, we want effectiveness, we want attitude, another one might be thinking and feeling. Suppose we have all thinking, we've got the right result, it's definitely working, but if people aren't buying it, if people don't want it, what's the point? If you have feeling or empathy, we can call that empathy, let's call it empathy. If you have empathy, then you can listen to what the people want and create solutions, and it may not be as fast. Again, you can push this out, but I'm suggesting that we probably want more empathy than just thinking. And in an organization, you're going to have your CFO, you're going to have your accountant, you're going to have your defensive verticals, and those defensive verticals are going to help you manage that. But at the end of the day, we have to be taking care of the customer, and the how we treat the employee is directly correlated with customer satisfaction. So we have to take care of the employees too, and you don't want to sleep on that. And then another one would be, and we see this with social media, we see this with the news cycles. We have speed and we have accuracy. And it's gotten so bad. I mean, there are YouTube channels that, I see them changing the name of the channel over and over and over. They're relying on clickbait to get people to click, and what's in there has nothing to do with the title. I saw a piece by Denzel Washington. He said the news channels are so focused on getting there first that they're not taking the time to look at accuracy. Influencers, they're so focused on getting there first, and not all, right? But they're not focused on the accuracy and the depth. And yes, it does get the job done in the short term, but when it comes time, like I said, in a pandemic, Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you see who's not wearing a bathing suit. And so I would say that we want accuracy over speed in general. Now, sometimes you're in a dire situation, fight or flight, existential crisis. You're going to have to go with some speed and then come back. But I talked about short-term fixes. So hopefully this kind of paints a picture. And what I'm doing here, assuming that we've gone most of the time not so maybe we haven't been living with these first 6 steps of every one of those 33,000 decisions. And so we don't feel any agency when it comes to step 6. We don't feel like we have any agency. Step 7, by the way, didn't talk about. This is the mindfulness. This is the present moment, getting back to a calm state, an effective state, a good state of being, so that we're back here in step 1 and 2, ready for that next stimulus to come. Because we want to be focused on our life design. We don't want to be whipsawed by anything. But that's why I ignore a lot of the things that come through. But the step 6, we may feel like we don't have a choice. We may feel like there's nothing we can do. And what I want to do here, what I'm doing here, is saying yes, there is something that you can do. And by arriving at this step 6 and making that a habit, it's not going to happen overnight, right? Your habits didn't get formed overnight. I would say in 6 months you'll have a good handle on it. You'll see major improvements in 3 months. That's why I have a 90-day reset. The 90-day transformation program focuses on the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. We don't do a lot with the relationship, professional, financial in terms of new information, but we do have the person work on a particular quest so we can find weak links and then come back and work through those using the 7 steps. But now, once you have this resolved, you can do what you set out to do. And by doing what you've set out to do, you now have you're back to agency and personal leadership. So let's take a look at this other one. So I already talked about frameworks. Now I want to just talk about what are some of the obstacles that get in the way when it comes to taking action. So I call this leading through the tension of action. There's tension. When we're taking action, there's a lot of tension. One, because the subconscious or the network of neurons doesn't like the unfamiliar. So by definition, if we're making a decision in a new area that's unfamiliar, we're going to have some tension there. A lot of times you talk to people, and if you're leading or coaching, you've seen this. People don't want to leave first base. They want to get to second, baseball metaphor. They want to get to second base, but they don't want to leave first. That's that fear of leaving the known. I've heard people talk about it. You have to leap. Sometimes you just have to make the leap and trust. People keep cutting that thing in half and cut it in half, getting to that distance of when they have to leap, and they just put off leaping. And rather than leaping, they go back and redesign. They go back to doing other things. For me, I always went back to school. That was my way of dealing with the tension. I'm not saying that was the best thing, but what it did is it gave me a chance to get out of fear and get out of fight or flight and then reset. Counter will. This is the I don't want power. I mentioned this in the earlier steps. Willpower is what people have relied on. They've learned to rely on willpower in the 20s, teens and 20s, because it worked. We had an abundance of neurotransmitters. During the 20s, the prefrontal cortex was being formed, and that came with 20 billion neurons. So there's an abundance of neurotransmitter, plenty of excess to fuel willpower. Once it's formed, the willpower it wanes. Willpower wanes with age. It doesn't. I mean, after 30, and it does wane all the way through 50 and on. It wanes with decision making. It wanes with use. And meanwhile, the I don't want power can grow. It's reinforced by habits. Now, what is I don't want power? Let's say that you you've talked to people who maybe they had a bad situation in a car or on a bridge, and they just don't want to go across a bridge, and they drive a circuitous route, or maybe they have to fly or whatever it is. They just I don't want to go over that bridge, and it's a metaphor. But the thing that they want is on the other side of the bridge, but the I don't want power is so strong. A more practical example is maybe a person has decided that they don't want to sell, they don't like selling, but now they're the CEO or they're in the C-suite, and one of their responsibilities is to sell, but they've got this I don't want power pushing them, and they don't want to sell. They don't know what it is. They just can't get there. They just can't engage, and everywhere else they're effective, but they just can't get over it. And it's again, you can hear it as a coach. You can hear it when the I don't want power is strong and in resistance. And the thing about it is that if the I don't want power is at the existential level, fight or flight, life or death, then it will always find energy to overpower and suppress the willpower. I'm not going to say that removing the I don't want power is going to magically give you all this willpower, but some of that willpower is waning just because you're dealing with I don't want power. So getting rid of the resistance is going to help your willpower be more useful, but the 7-step process is more reliable than just willpower because willpower wanes. Decision resistance, avoidance of commitment, self-explanatory, and a lot of times the fear of success is a bigger obstacle than fear of failure. But and that's why I call it the tension of action. That tension is coming from something. So one of the things that I talk about is anxiety and excitement have the same signature. When you're about to have a breakthrough, you can't have a breakthrough without a break with. So preceding a breakthrough, you have confusion. That confusion will create avoidance of commitment. Now, it doesn't mean go willy-nilly, but most people, most leaders, and certainly business owners will tell you that they have to make decisions and act with a, a portion of the information. I think in the corporate world, I was comfortable with 80% of the information, then I would move. And as an entrepreneur, when I had a global business, I had to move with 60% of the information. You couldn't wait. Things were happening too fast, and then you adjust. So the decision is not good or bad in and of itself. It's made so by what you do next. You have to have that confidence that you can do whatever's necessary. So step in, make the choice, figure out what's coming, just like the general said. They've been fighting back and forth. It doesn't make sense to keep going. Just make a decision and monitor the results and adjust if needed or as needed. Comfort and familiar. So this is an interesting one because when you are going into the unfamiliar, there's a lot of resistance, and because neurons that fire together wire together, you can get this anxiety that comes up that keeps people from moving. And it's the cognitive dissonance that accompanies breaking through. I already said breakthrough is preceded by a break with, but there's a cognitive dissonance, especially if you're going against things that you believe or your stories. You've been telling yourself stories for years, and now you're doing something that the stories that you told yourself said you can't do, but you're doing it. You're going to have some cognitive dissonance. This is neuroplasticity in action. The nervous system is literally rewiring the neural pathways real time. That's why you get this brain fog and this uncertainty, and a lot of people stop. It's where you just back off, come back the next day, get a good night's sleep, and you'll find a very interesting thing happens. Here's what I would say that you can experience. So let's say that you're going along, and now you're trying to break out. As you try to break out, you didn't recognize it, but there's a barrier. And this barrier has your beliefs, habits, stories, patterns, etc., successes. And I say successes because sometimes something works so well we're not willing to try anything else. Your successes, your failures, all of that's in this barrier. And as you get into the barrier, you you run into these points of tension, and oftentimes you just come right back down and we keep going the way we've been. It's very difficult to break through that because there's a lot going on. So this is also unfamiliar. Now, if I take if I blow that scene up, what happens is as we're going through this line, this unfamiliar, think of it like all your habits are saying, they're screaming, no, 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 this is danger. It's danger, danger, and go back. When you go, when you accept that it's the cognitive dissonance of going through this barrier, you go to bed, and it doesn't matter if you get a good night's sleep or not. In fact, this neuroplasticity actually accelerates while you're sleeping. And it's during the day there's too much going on. It's like trying to get through the day, but it's also trying to build new neural pathways. So you have all these neurons, neural pathways, ones that fire together and wire together. You have all this resistance saying, no, this is dangerous, but you're going through it. And then when you break through those neural pathways, this is my vision of how I explain it. Once you break through, so this is going to happen multiple times. It's going to happen multiple times as you're going through this barrier. They flip, and now you have them saying, "Yes, we can do this. Yes, we can do this. Go, go, go," because we want to survive. Once you flip through, it goes from danger, don't go, it's dangerous, to once you cross, go, go, go. It's almost like you're sitting there not wanting to cross the street because the cars are going, and you're trying to get your courage up, and you're sitting there in the cars, and you're scared to go, and you're scared to go, and then finally there's a break, and you go. So that's sort of what happens here. But then the next day you get into a new range, right? Now you're in a new range, and this new range, it causes the same thing again. You've got this same issue to get through there, and then you're going to have another one. And this happens over and over, which is why it's a 90-day program. But you're going to start noticing this, and then once you recognize it, it's the cognitive dissonance that occurs when you go through the barrier. Now you know what to do with it. And then so that's the comfort in the familiar processes. Another way to look at the familiar processes, I remember being on a team, and we were tasked with doing many new things. And the go-to for this team was to always pull out a previous presentation, a previous PowerPoint, and start there. And as I look back, we were just getting in our own way because we're innovating, but we pull back the old. So we're priming ourselves with the old stuff while we're trying to do something new. It's very natural that you're going to have resistance and challenges, and the words that you use, you're forcing things to fit. Another way to look at it, I mentioned before the Merlin method, that instead of asking yourself, what should I do? Ask yourself, what's my outcome? And you make the last box first, and then the next box before it, and the next box before it, and the next box before it. I'm talking in terms of the process flow. So you don't just say, what do I do next? Or what should I do? You say, what's my outcome? What has to be in place for this to happen? And then you figure out what to do there. You work your way back to what to do now, and it's going to be different than what it would have been if you just say, what do I do? Especially if you're creating in the field of the possibilities. Momentum mismanagement, and I kind of talked about it with the cognitive dissonance and the being able to break through and recognizing that, okay, I've broken through another barrier, sub barrier. Now I have that resistance again, and sometimes you just need to get away from it, do something else. So I do see the tension and the difficulty between project and operation. And if you're in project mode for too long, innovation mode for too long, you will get exhausted because it's demanding on your conscious mind. And the conscious mind only processes 11 million bits per second. The brain uses fully 20% of our daily basal metabolism at rest. So if you are designing and innovating, the brain is a hog for nutrients, and you can feel that exhaustion coming. And so you need to give yourself some breaks, and those breaks can be alternating between the operation versus project, going out for a walk, anything to give yourself a break. And then the last one is identity lag, and that encapsulizes the nervous system not catching up. So the gurus will tell you that before you do something new, before you start on a new quest, reset your identity. And that's the idea of the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional areas being first, the be and the do, and then you go after the have, the relationship, professional, financial. But this lag, this identity lag, has to catch up, and even while you're in it, it still has to catch up because each day you are learning something new. You're running into new barriers, and then you're overcoming those barriers. And by overcoming those barriers, you have the ability to do something new. I see that the screen wasn't up, so let me just put that up one more time. So there you go. It's the oh, and then I left off the needing to be right. So this is the I used to mentor. So I was building high performing teams. I have a phase that I went through, and I had to build a new high performing team every other year because we would do these major initiatives, and then I have to create a routine for the next initiative. The initiatives were different, and it required different expertise. And I got into making sure I was getting hot, very bright people. And one of the things I noticed in general with a lot of the A students is that they had difficulty making or coming up with a point of view. The the way I looked at it was the way to get an A or maintain a 4.0 GPA is you have to give the professors what they're looking for. If you deviate from that, you can get a 90 instead of 100, and now you're looking at not having a 4.0. So they were conditioned to give the professors what they wanted. And I noticed that a lot of these folks would come in and they had green field, they could do whatever they want. They certainly had the skills, but they were looking over their shoulder. They wanted to know what's the answer. What's the answer supposed to be? So I literally trained them on how to have a coming up with a I say train, I condition them to have a point of view and to trust their point of view that it's going to be directionally correct, and then we can adjust. Once we did that, it it they were able to run fast, and there was more intrinsic motivation. There are some people who are very comfortable having a point of view, even when it's not right in research, and those people make progress because they can do the trial and error. Now, neither one of those is perfect. You want to have a blend. You want to be able to come up with a point of view that's research, that's based on research, critical thinking, first principles thinking. But you also want to be comfortable with taking action and then going through the fight or flight. That's kind of what I was talking about, related to what I was talking about. 60% of the information I have to go. And then we said to start, stop. I like the Pomodoro technique. You look that up online, 25 minutes, and then you take a 5